You are about to get a masterclass in the science of muscle growth. You had to pick out the one thing that's most important for building muscle.
I would say intensity of effort. And this actually has been somewhat of a shift in my philosophy over the years, but I'd say the biggest change is in the effect of loading on hypertrophy. You can achieve similar hypertrophy with repetitions anywhere from 6 reps all the way up to 30 to 40 reps.
Welcome back to the Dr. Layne Norton podcast. I'm your host, Layne Norton, and today I have a special treat for you guys. I am interviewing Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. Now, as I say during the episode, if I had a Mount Rushmore of hypertrophy researchers, Brad Schoenfeld is one of the first people I'm putting up there. He's George Washington and Stu Phillips is Abraham Lincoln, or vice versa. They're both very, very well-known and very high-level hypertrophy researchers. Brad has published some of the most impactful things on hypertrophy research, and more than that, in addition to trying to determine the physiological underpinnings of how muscle grows and hypertrophies, Brad has very practical takeaways. He's going to give you information that you can actually make actionable plans with. Not just, oh, wow, that's interesting, but you don't know what to do with it. And that's because Brad, before he was a researcher, he was a personal trainer and I believe competed in bodybuilding as well. So he's always coming at it from an application perspective. Mechanisms are interesting. All that stuff's interesting. But what is the practical takeaways? This interview was extremely educational for me. I learned a lot, and I just love talking to Brad, and quite frankly, probably could have talked to him for 3 more hours about this stuff. So you guys are going to enjoy this because you are about to get a master class in the science of muscle growth. So stay tuned if you want to blow your mind on growing muscle. Guys, I am so excited to have Professor Brad Schoenfeld here on the show. I think Brad is I think he is the most impactful researcher for muscular hypertrophy in pretty much the history of hypertrophy research. What I really think is cool about what Brad does is it's like he was reading Flex magazine and Muscular Development, all these magazines at the same time I was growing up, and then got to a university and was like, well, let's just test some of these things that these people said in these magazines. And so I really love that he is doing high-level human randomized control trials with very practical outcomes. I think that that is what's very cool to answer a lot of these training questions we've had. So I'm really excited to have him on the show. Brad, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Layne.
So you're one of the most published researchers in muscular hypertrophy in the world. What led you to this? Like, what got you interested in this? How did you end up going down this career path? Because, I mean, people don't realize there's been kind of an explosion in hypertrophy research in the last decade. But before that, I mean, it was very, very difficult, I want to say previous to 2010, to really find much of anything in resistance training and hypertrophy. It was very, very scattered research. So what led you to be interested in this?
Yeah, you basically hit the nail on the head. So I was an aspiring bodybuilder back in the 90s, natural bodybuilder and personal trainer. My career actually evolved from being a personal trainer. And when I was a bodybuilder, I did what many, if not most of the people did back then, and even some now, but I followed all the major bodybuilding magazines and my favorite bodybuilders and basically would take their routines and try to integrate them into my training. And I would pick like Lee Labrada's leg routine and Rich Gaspari's chest routine and Lee Haney's arm routine, etc. And then I'd switch it out and I'd get the next version of muscular development or whatever and pick different bodybuilders. And at the beginning, it worked for me to some extent, but I quickly plateaued and it set me down the path towards trying to find a better way to go about it, and that led me into research. But as you said, at that point, there was really very little direct research, particularly on variables. And I I was personal training, and I was training a lot of aspiring physique competitors. And it was the same thing. And so certainly there was enough research. I didn't really know that much back then. I was not a scientist, or the scientist I am now. But I was able to utilize what we had and to improve upon my results. And long story short, I ended up just becoming more and more interested in the scientific aspect, which led me to go on and get my master's and PhD and then go into academia. And like you said, I'm a kid in a candy store now. Basically, I'm researching everything that I had wanted to. And to your point, when I started my research journey, and this was back circa 2010, a little 15 years ago now, there really was not much in the realm of specific hypertrophy-oriented research. So bodybuilder was always kind of the bastard child of the strength and conditioning profession. I thought it was all steroids. And anyway, it was something that the only reason hypertrophy was studied because it had a correlation with strength for strength-related athletes. And when I was a personal trainer, I could count on both hands how many times a client came in and said, I want to take a second off of my sprint time or get an extra inch of the jump height. And it was all I wanted to look great naked, which turned out to be my website. And basically it was about gaining muscle, losing body fat. And I was kind of astounded that there wasn't more research. And I think certainly I feel very proud of the fact that I helped to further that aspect of research. And as you know now, we have just an abundance. Certainly we need a lot more, but we've come so far in a relatively short period of time in the research.
Yeah, I mean, previous to 2010, and certainly previous to the year 2000, a lot of our understanding was purely anecdotal, other than some scattered, very, very basic and mostly poorly performed research studies in resistance training, as you said, looking at strength or performance or whatnot. And a lot of what we tried to piece together about what might happen with resistance training, we did from endurance training. Like I even, as a competitive powerlifter, the peaking protocols for powerlifting, a lot of them were originally derived from styles of peaking for endurance exercise. Okay, you maintain intensity, you cut volume down, those sorts of things. And I always remembered thinking, why would we assume that this would be the same? Like maybe it is, but I have no reason to believe that it would be the same, right? And it is very interesting that the vanity aspect is what people have fixated on, and it is what people care about, whether they want to believe it or not. Sure, people love their health markers improving. They love to see, better insulin sensitivity, lower risk of these diseases. But the reality is, looking at numbers on a page of blood markers isn't what motivates people. People get motivated seeing a physical change in the mirror. And unfortunately, I can't think of anything else in research where there is such an interest in a specific thing, but for a long time it was shunned to do research on that specific thing, body composition. Because, there's like this weird, we're better than this, we shouldn't care about how we look sort of vibe. And what's really interesting is as we have learned more and more, and I've learned way more from doing research for my first book, what you find is muscular hypertrophy in a lot of ways is very synonymous with overall health. If you want to talk about improved insulin sensitivity, reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer mortality, upper respiratory disease mortality, ICU, length of stay and mortality. I mean, even like cognition, the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia is significantly reduced by having more muscle mass. But nobody knows about these things, or at least they don't really get talked about, because when people hear muscle, they think, oh, this is just vanity. They don't think about health.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it leads to the point that we shouldn't be placing judgments on why someone wants to do something. And regardless of what the motivation is, you're going to achieve all of those benefits. That's the beauty is it's not like you just train for aesthetics and you don't get the other benefits. They come along for the ride, basically. So as you point out, resistance training is probably, in my humble opinion, the overall most important thing you can do for your health, because it provides benefits that other forms of exercise don't. And let's say aerobic exercise, which I'm a big fan of doing some aerobic exercise, but resistance training will provide you with cardiovascular benefits. So there's a lot of, by the way, you see my doggy in the background who always wants to get me there. But anyway, yeah, it's to me, regardless of the motivation, only the last, if I recall, the last statistics I saw showed that only 20% of the population meets the basic guidelines for muscle strengthening, which is 2 days a week. So, the fact that if you can get more people into training, whatever their motivation, to me, that's a win.
Absolutely. And like you said, we shouldn't be judging people based on the motivations. I don't really care if somebody wants to look better, with their shirt off or whatever. If that is a motivation that gets them in to do this and then they reap the other health benefits because of it, then who are we to judge? And I think we should be leaning into that rather than trying to run from it. It should be, you'll look better, you'll have better body composition, and also here's all the added bonuses, right? Because at the end of the day, it's difficult to get people to think about, mortality and risk of cardiovascular. That all seems like very abstract stuff to people. That's very, very abstract. For scientists, it seems very black and white. Well, you don't want to die when you're 70, you want to die when you're 82 or whatever it is. So let's reduce these risks. Well, unfortunately, most people don't have good, what research scientists call recency, which is they value very short-term data over very long-term data. And so this is why, I'm sure you're familiar with the polls of Olympic athletes. I think over 50% said if you could take a drug that would get you a gold medal, but it would kill you within 5 years, would you do it? And like 90% said yes, So
particularly when you're young.
Right.
When someone's young, mortality is just not on the horizon. So, or at least they don't perceive it as. As people start to get older, then health usually becomes more of a benefit, more of a desired benefit. But certainly, I don't think the desire to improve aesthetics ever goes away for the vast majority of people.
Right, exactly. And I think there should be more research scientists leaning into that and using that as the carrot, which is, hey, you do these things, you're going to look way better. And then, oh, by the way, you're going to get these added benefits as well. And I think people have also conflated, the idea of like, well, too much muscle is bad for you because look at all these bodybuilders that die. And it's like, yeah, but there's some significant confounding variables in that mix that, a lot of people don't really want to discuss, that being not just anabolic steroids, but all kinds of different compounds. And typically, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but people who are willing to push themselves that far in something tend to have pretty extreme personalities overall and tend to be willing to do other extreme things as well. So I think we got to be careful painting with too broad a brush when it comes to muscle.
Well, there's no question. If you look at the old school bodybuilders back in the 40s, I am somewhat of a historian on bodybuilding, and you look before this steroid era, which goes back before the 1960s, they lived quite long. They had very healthy and not only quite long, especially relative to how long people were living in those days, but also much better quality of lives. And there's been some very recent studies on masters athletes, so the natural masters athletes. And if you look at the data as far as their muscular health, it's amazing that they have muscle mass over and above sedentary younger individuals. So masters athletes actually maintain more muscle than 20-year-olds who have not trained. And even the masters athletes who are younger, it's pretty close. So yeah, you are going to have some diminished results over time. You don't maintain the ability to build muscle into your 60s, 70s, but you can maintain the majority of it and certainly still make gains if you're untrained, where it's not much different. And from a functional standpoint, obviously from an aesthetic standpoint that matters, but from a functional standpoint and a health standpoint, that has huge ramifications.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have seen like the MRI of the 70-year-old, I think he was an Ironman or triathlete. His, I think it was his quadricep versus like a 40-year-old sedentary person versus a young person. And you can't really tell the difference between the young person's quadricep and the older person who trains quadricep, but you can tell a difference in the person who doesn't train. Not just the muscle size, but the quality, because it's not just important about building muscle. When you are resistance training, you are, even if you don't net increase your muscle mass, the process of turning it over, of synthesis and degradation, you are keeping that muscle, for lack of a better term, fresh. You're going to have better quality muscle by, even if you're not building any, just by doing resistance training and making that stuff turn over. And I think that's a point that a lot of people miss.
Yeah, and to your point, there's much less fatty infiltration in muscle. So if you look at a sedentary older individual who's has not trained in the past, the muscle looks like a marbled steak, and often it's less meat, more fat than meat. Whereas a resistance trained older masters athlete, it's very little marbling of the muscle, and that has ramifications. You think, what's the difference? That's what at least is one of the factors that's implicated in insulin resistance, as far as obviously an inability to have a functional effect on the muscle. So anyway, there's multiple issues, as you mentioned, not only with the size, but with the quality of the muscle.
Yeah, I mean, I always refer to muscle as a metabolic sink. And so you point out fat infiltration into muscle tissue. If we look at like insulin resistance, I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, which as you know is basically the layperson interpretation is when all things are equal, the simplest answer is typically true. And so people want to make all these like strong metabolic comments about insulin resistance, and it's caused by this and it's caused by that. And they've tried to, there are people who say, well, fats cause it. Well, carbs cause it. Well, branched amino acids cause it. They've gone through like the list of basically every nutrient can cause it. And I think it's a much more simple answer than that. And I refer to muscle as a metabolic sink because if you've got a sink with a plug in it, okay, these are people, so a sink with a plug in it would be people who are not well muscled. Your sink, your static sink would be like your glycogen and adipose tissue. And then the faucet running, that faucet is nutrients coming in. Okay. Now, if you create a small sieve in that sink, it will still drain a little bit and you'll be able to get throughput, right? So the drain is basically your muscle tissue. And the reason I say this is you have a certain amount of glycogen you can store. It's, in the entire body, 500 grams, depending on your size. Then you don't really have a storage capacity for protein. So if you have excess protein, you have to use it for synthesis or oxidize it. And then with fats, we've termed it an unlimited storage capacity, but we do know that adipocytes or fat cells, that they are only viable up to about 100 microns in diameter. And once you start to hit that threshold of filling up fat cells more than that, yes, you can produce more fat cells, and there's good evidence that adult humans do this if they go past that threshold, but you never produce enough or fast enough to start getting your blood sugar and blood lipids back down. And so what is happening, because you have exceeded your body's storage capacity for these nutrients, now where do they have to go? They're backed up into the bloodstream because your plug in your sink is too big, or rather the opening is too small to drain these out, right? Now, if I build a lot of muscle, if you're resistance training, what you're doing is you're taking the plug out of that sink. You are opening up your body's capacity to deal with excess nutrients because muscle is greedy. It's going to oxidize more glucose. It's going to oxidize more fatty acids. It's much more metabolically active. And so by doing that, I've seen research studies with resistance training, or I think I saw one in obese males that 16 weeks of resistance training, when they had never resistance trained before, 16 weeks of resistance training, all improved their insulin sensitivity by almost 50%. Like that's a good luck getting that out of drugs. You know what I mean? I don't know if you agree with any of that, but I've always kind of tried to explain it that way.
No, I agree with all of it. And there's more too, because resistance training also, number one, increases the sensitivity of the insulin receptors, which function like doors. Basically, they allow the glucose to come in and be stored. And also of the glucose transporters. There are GLUT4 transporters within the muscle, and it wakes, basically they're kind of the chaperones that go to the cell surface to the insulin receptors and bring in the glucose, and they are awakened, if you will. They are sensitized. So it's a multifaceted process from the information that I've seen, and yeah, it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, no, and Brad, you're absolutely right. Right down at a mechanistic level, at a cellular level. For those who aren't familiar, the way glucose gets into your muscle cells is you have these glucose transporters that typically reside in the nucleus. And when insulin hooks up to the cell, it will cause what's called a translocation of these receptors to the cell surface, which then allows glucose into the cell. But also when you resistance train, or I'm pretty sure any form of exercise will do it as well. But when you do some form of exercise, resistance train, that also independently causes an increased translocation of these glucose transporters so that your body is primed to be able to dispose of more glucose. All right, so we've talked about a lot of the benefits of muscle mass. It's not just for vanity. Now, let's talk about how people can build more muscle mass for their health, but also, quite frankly, just so they can look more jacked and feel better about themselves and feel better about how they look in the mirror. Because, it was funny. I used to tell my PhD advisor, he's like, how is the cure for sarcopenia going? And I'm like, don't you mean the secret to getting jacked? He goes, yeah, but when we write the grants, we have to say sarcopenia. So, Brad, if you had to pick out the one thing that's most important for building muscle, what would you say is the most important thing for building muscle?
Yeah, I without hesitation would say intensity of effort. And this actually has been somewhat of a shift in my philosophy over the years, because I grew up as an aspiring bodybuilder, and I kind of followed the go all out or go home school of thought, where you had to take every set to failure and then do forced reps or drop sets to go beyond any of these intensification techniques. And if you weren't walking out trashed after that session where, every set was taken to failure, you had not gotten a good workout. But that actually does not seem to be true based on the research that we've accumulated over time. But you need to be relatively close. You need to be within a couple, 3 reps short of failure, depending on rep range and some other things. But you need to train very hard. 2 reps short of failure is still a very difficult set. If you are starting to get further and further away, you can get strength. So strength can increase somewhat further away from failure. But as far as, particularly if you're using heavier loads, but hypertrophy, you need to be training relatively close. And if not, all the other variables really don't matter much or have limited benefits or limited relevance if you are not training with proper intensity of effort.
So you're saying, your school of thought didn't change that you needed to be intense, but your school of thought changed in terms of how intense you needed to be. My understanding is that just like what you've said, that taking a set to failure, I guess it's kind of like easy objectively because you know that is an intense set. But you're right. From what I've seen, the research data shows that if you're within 1 or 2 reps of failure, certainly within 1 or 2 reps of failure, it appears that you get the same benefits as long as you're doing the same number of hard sets. And it's interesting you bring up the disconnect with strength, because that is true. In fact, I believe Zach Robinson, who coaches me for powerlifting, released a series of papers that supported this and basically showed that proximity to failure didn't have much of a prediction with strength outcomes, whereas it did with hypertrophy. And, Zach has had this idea for a long time. The expression of strength is basically force production. And so if you're taking a load that is further from failure, but you're moving it as quickly as you possibly can, your force production is still high. And he actually theorized that training close to failure too often with strength could be detrimental, because as you approach failure, your reps slow down. And so your force production goes down. So for example, let's say, for me, right now I could probably squat 500 for 10 reps if I went all out. But by those last few reps, my force production is going to be way down because the velocity on those is going to be way down. But what if instead of doing 10 reps, I did 5 sets of 2? It's still the same volume, the same exposure in terms of the weight, the force, or the weight, but each rep is going to have better force production because I can move it faster because I have less intraset fatigue. So I don't know if you've looked into any of that stuff, but this typically strength and hypertrophy go together, but this is one area where it seems like they kind of diverge.
Yeah, and I will say this, that the evidence on this is still evolving, that the studies, we don't have a ton of studies. We have probably 12. We did a meta-analysis on this. Zap did an excellent meta regression on the topic. And look, in Zach's meta regression, and it was an excellent paper, but they had to use a lot of intuitive, basically in trying to ascertain what people's RIR was, they were making assumptions that we're not sure. It's very difficult based on the write-up of a study to know how accurate those assumptions are. So some hesitation has to be used in terms of trying to extrapolate the dose response, if you will. But I'd say this. Number one, every study on the topic has looked at all sets to failure versus no sets to failure. One of the perceived negatives of going to failure all the time in multi-set protocols is that it's going to have negative effects on your volume load. It's going to cause greater fatigue. So the subsequent sets, you're going to have reduced repetition output or load output. You don't have to go to failure on all the sets. What about if you just did the last set to failure? Could that be more hypertrophic? We've not looked at, or there hasn't been good evidence to look at the difference between multi versus single joints. So certainly a squat to failure is going to cause a greater reduction in volume load than a lateral raise to failure, if you would. And the effect on the overall fatigue, the systemic effect, is going to be different. We don't have good evidence on the younger versus older. As people get older, their recovery process is diminished. So these are all things that, while we can, and by the way, I'd also say we don't have evidence in very highly trained. We have evidence in resistance trained individuals, but a resistance trained individual is someone with a year plus of experience to the average person you see in the gym. So when we get our participants, yeah, they are trained, so they're not getting newbie gains. And some of them are actually, there's a spectrum. We have some that have competed in bodybuilding, but most of them are in that intermediate range. You go to a gym, and they're the people that you see working out in the gym for the past couple of years. And it could be, it's just maybe my bias and going back to my bodybuilding days, but as you start getting closer to your genetic ceiling, it's potentially going to failure on some of your sets may be a means towards overcoming a plateau, to challenging your body beyond its present state, which is needed for adaptation. So these are all things that we don't know. And if you're asking my own recommendation now, I do think that selective use of failure on, let's say, the last set, particularly on your single joint movements, can be a viable strategy to potential. I don't think there's any perceived negative to doing so. And I think there's a potential benefit. So that's a win for me.
You just said so many things in there that I want to touch on. And essentially, on a pragmatic level, we are completely in alignment. I tell people, train close to failure, but going to absolute failure, I'd use it relatively sparingly. Definitely the last set of an exercise, preferably of single joint exercises. And my reasoning is something like the following. You mentioned the intraset fatigue on compound exercises. I can tell you, if I had a set of 10 to failure on squats and I just did 5 reps, so staying 5 reps away from failure, that would feel more fatiguing to me than taking leg extensions to failure. That would be more fatiguing to me. Not just the muscular load, but the load overall my body, the concentration that I would need to execute those reps properly, And then like, honestly, just the lung capacity too. Like squats are a whole different ball game. And so, you know, I'm not saying never to take compound exercises to failure, but I do think there is much greater effort required. Like all failure is not the same. Failure on a compound exercise is far, far different than failure on a single joint. And to your point, there was a study, I think it was done by Zach Robinson, where they had people will train 2 reps shy of failure for an entire training cycle, or they had them take all sets to failure. And they showed basically very similar outcomes for, I think, almost every metric they looked at. But what was interesting was the group that didn't go to failure actually had a higher volume load. They did more reps overall throughout the course of the experiment. And some people may say, well, that doesn't make sense. If you're taking every set to failure, you're going to get the most reps out of it. But think about, if you take a set to failure, what your rep decay is after that on each subsequent set. You know, if I take a set of hack squats to failure for 10 reps, if I keep the same load, the next set I might get, I don't know, 5 or 6 reps. And then the set after that, I might get 3 or 4. I mean, so whereas if I had just done sets of 8 for 4 sets versus maybe say 10, 6, 4, 3, that's 9 reps more total across those 4 sets, even though I didn't take any of them to failure. So that's kind of my I did want to ask you on that note. I remember reading something that perhaps compound exercises don't need to get as close to failure because there's higher muscle activation. So perhaps you could stay a little bit further from failure with a compound because it is perceived higher effort. Compared to isolation, you might have to go closer to failure. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because I do remember reading that.
So that is a theory. I've never seen that. I've seen the EMG. There's been EMG analysis, but EMG analysis does not necessarily, or you can't necessarily extrapolate those results into training studies, longitudinal studies. And I don't believe there is any longitudinal evidence. I think it's a possibility, but as a true scientist, I am always curious, always skeptical, and always willing to change my opinion. So perhaps that comes in. And just as an aside, I believe the study that you referred to was Martin Refalo's study. They used the within subject design where one leg was doing to failure, the other leg was doing a couple of reps short of failure. It was Martin Refalo out of Australia. And a great study, by the way, trained subjects. But yeah, it was an eye-opening, and that was really, to me, when I say definitive, a study is only a piece in a puzzle. So, but it was, I think, the most well done of the studies that we can really use to extrapolate proximity to failure. And I think it was very nicely demonstrated there that, especially with the within subject design, which has much greater statistical power because of the controlling of other external variables.
So when Brad says within subject design, basically each person is acting as their own control because what they're doing is they're doing unilateral movements. So I believe in this case, it was like leg press and leg extensions. So the one leg was going to failure. The other leg was staying a couple reps shy on each of those exercises. And as Brad said, the benefit to that is when you randomize people, the point of randomization is that you can assume that any kind of inherent characteristic or differences amongst people will be randomly distributed across the groups. But if you can go a step further and you have this within subject design, now you've completely essentially eliminated differences, at least within the individual. So, and you've also eliminated genetic differences, because you are comparing the same person to themselves. And since we know that muscle growth is an intrinsic process, some people want to argue there's crossover. I would say small muscles with strength, maybe, but not for hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is a very intrinsic process. I think that this research data is relatively conclusive.
Just your point, Lane. I know that has been a claim of some people. We do have evidence of a crossover effect with strength, as you pointed out, but any hypertrophy, and there's been quite a number of studies on this, it's negligible. So the hypertrophic crossover is just not something that is observed and not something that we can consider a confounding issue.
Yeah, there's a very popular clip circulating on social media from a neuroscientist she says, resistance trained men just thought about lifting weights for 2 weeks and they increased their muscle mass by 13%. And when I saw this clip, I'm like, there is no effing way that this study exists, right? So I find the study, and it wasn't in trained men. It wasn't over 2 weeks. It was, I think, 12. And the 13% they saw was an increase, I believe, in elbow flexor strength when they thought about lifting on one side versus the other. Which, okay, I mean, that's like if you're, I don't know, in some kind of accident or bedridden or whatever, and you can't train, I guess thinking about training is better than not. But like that is a far cry from 13% increase in muscle mass. This is not the same thing. And it just goes to show you how quickly these things can be misinterpreted on social media. I think we talked about this before. When somebody puts out nonsense, the effort required to refute said nonsense is orders of magnitude higher than what it takes to perpetuate the nonsense. I think it's like something like 10 to 100 times more efforts required to debunk it than it is to propagate it in the first place.
Yeah, look, and the biggest challenge that we face as scientists, true scientists, is the reality that people like very simplistic discussions. Like if people, first of all, the algorithms and social media favor being definitive and boisterous and controversial. So if you can say this is the way it is, and they're very definitive about it, and that's as we all know, or as scientists know, that's generally not the way applied science works. That your evidence exists on a continuum from weak to strong. And in most applied cases, there's not much evidence that, at least that I would consider very strong. So we're talking with a lot of uncertainty as to most of these topics. And when we express that, people consider you wishy-washy, you can't make up your mind. Well, that's science. And if you want to be definitive, the other sad thing is that when people get very hardened to this, they then don't want to walk back when all of a sudden evidence, as it often does, shows the opposite. So they get locked into a position. They start to refute any evidence coming out that opposes their position, which again is anti-scientific. So.
We call that cognitive dissonance, and unfortunately, that's kind of the norm now with social media. And I always tell people it's going to sound weird. People ask me like, how do I know who to listen to? And I said, you know what? If I was trying to pick out an expert in a field that I didn't know much about, based on what I know about this field, is what I would look for would actually be pretty counterintuitive, which would be somebody who isn't making definitive statements, who a lot of times you ask them a question, they'll ask you a question or two back. They will give you the devil's advocate argument typically, but explain why they think their argument or what they believe is better supported by research data. And they'll use words like maybe, probably, possibly, suggests. They don't say best, worst, always, never. They don't use superlatives like that. And one of the things I'll tell people is like, one of my favorite quotes is by Bertrand Russell, which is, only fools and zealots are sure of themselves and wise people are filled with doubts. And so when you're looking for an expert, you're actually looking for someone who kind of sounds unsure, but they understand the angles. You can talk to them and they understand the nuance of these topics. They're just not exactly sure where they land, which one of the things I tell people, so when you see me plant my flag really strongly about something, you probably should pay attention because I don't do that very often, Now, speaking of which, I asked you what the most important thing was, which was, you said intensity of effort. Now, I've read a lot online that it's, mechanical tension. Mechanical tension is the most important thing for hypertrophy. Are these two different things? Is intensity or intensity of effort and mechanical tension related? Can you explain what mechanical tension is and why people say it's important?
They're not directly related, but mechanical tension are the forces that are acting on a muscle during a resistive bout. When there's imposed resistance, it's the forces that are placed in the muscle. And these forces then are chemically transduced. They turn these mechanical signals into chemical signals by a process called mechanotransduction. And that sets off an enzymatic cascade. So enzymes basically are facilitators. They speed up processes, and it goes through this kind of pinball, if you will, effect of going from upstream where it's close to the point of transduction down to downstream where protein translation and ultimately protein synthesis takes place. And there's different pathways that are involved, but mechanical tension is well documented as the primary mechanism by which muscle growth is carried out. And certainly it's the primary mechanism that initiates the process. If you do not have mechanical tension, you're going to see negligible, if any, muscle development, muscle growth. So without mechanical tension, basically is the trigger, if you will, to set off this cascade, everything else becomes irrelevant.
Mechanical tension, force on the muscle. So intensity of effort, these aren't mutually exclusive things. By having high intensity of effort, you're creating high mechanical tension is what you're saying.
Correct. But mechanical tension is going to be involved. Just to have mechanical tension, you lift the first rep on a 50 rep set. There's mechanical tension in your muscle. So mechanical tension will be involved from rep one, but it's the magnitude of tension. And this is where it gets, I don't know how deep you want to go, but this is where the slippery slope, and this is where a lot of people just, especially some of the influencers who don't understand research, start to extrapolate improperly, at least in my humble opinion. Because mechanical tension, number one, has both a magnitude of effect. So basically how much mechanical tension, the closer you get to failure, the greater the magnitude of tension, but it also has a time integral. So having a time-based, how long the muscle is under tension, not necessarily in a given set, but over a given session and over a given week and et cetera, over a period of time. And mechanical tension also has both active and passive components. So there's active tension and there's also passive tension, which has to do with stretch. It has to do with the length-tension relationship of muscle in a repetition. So again, multiple factors here to unpack that we don't have a great understanding of how they interact. We have some understanding of or a decent understanding, I think, of the mechanisms in play or the factors in play of mechanical tension, but the interaction between them and how they can be used to optimize hypertrophy still remains, again, I'm going to give the uncertainty, in my humble opinion, not well defined, not well characterized.
I'm glad you brought that up because my question to you, I was going to ask, I kind of know the answer already, but I was going to say, okay, well, if it's forces on the muscle, why not just do heavy singles or a heavy single, right? And this is, there's a gentleman on social media who really beats the drum of mechanical tension, but I don't think he understands it very well because he's very much about, well, you got to lift heavy. But then I'm like, okay, well, why are we doing heavy 4 to 8 reps? Why not just do 1 rep? Because that's going to be more force for that 1 rep. So obviously mechanical tension has to be a cumulative effect. It's not just the effect of a single repetition. And also, if it's just force on the muscle at a given time, you can apply the same force to a light load as you can to a heavy load. And so I think a lot of people have conflated mechanical tension just thinking about a set point in time versus the accumulation over the course of time, which actually leads me to my next question, because if it's accumulation over the course of time, is that why volume seems to matter? Because, we do have several meta-analyses, meta-regressions now that show that, you add more volume, you seem to get more hypertrophy. Is that because you're just kind of stacking up mechanical tension over time?
Yeah, so when you're asking to try to tie the mechanism into the effect, that becomes somewhat difficult. We can surmise about these things, but you can't provide a direct causal effect. Say, well, this is mechanical tension, so we know this, so we can necessarily say that higher value is going to be, or benefits of it are due to greater mechanical tension. Again, these are things that we can hypothesize about, but I think this is where people go astray, and especially influencers who don't understand it, that they're basing their philosophy on mechanistic work rather than the more important thing is to base it on the longitudinal studies that we have that have directly measured hypertrophy. So I certainly think that's one factor that probably is effectful there, but could there be other factors that are involved? There could, by the way, so that we know that mechanical tension is the primary mechanism. We cannot rule out other mechanistic factors as much as some people try to make it very black and white. Again, in my opinion, based on the research, there's conflicting evidence on various other things that potentially could be involved, particularly in a downstream effect. So again, mechanical tension is the well-established initiator, but could there be signaling? So these, what we talk about with mechanisms, are signals, stimuli that produce these signals. So could other stimuli be in effect? And there's been various potential stimuli. I don't think we want to go down that rabbit hole because, again, they're not well defined at this point. There's some evidence that shows they may be involved, some evidence that shows they aren't. I'm working on the next edition of my textbook, and it's just the beast trying to piece this together and to give, I think, perspective on objective perspective on how they may or may not be involved. But to make a long story short, volume, there's quite a bit of evidence now that there is a so-called dose-response relationship, meaning that when you increase volume, you are going to generally get greater hypertrophy. Now, people think when we talk about dose response that it's a linear effect. It is not. A dose response just means at some point you increase the amount of the dose that you're going to see a bigger effect. So I'll start out by saying this. The most important set is the first set. You're going to get the majority of development for the majority of people can be attained with very moderate volumes, modest volumes. So these quote unquote minimalist approaches can be very effective in promoting some hypertrophy. If you're the average Joe who just wants to gain some muscle, it's a very time efficient strategy, and probably it's not worth your effort in doing additional work. That's, again, a personal choice. But if you're someone, again, we both come from bodybuilding backgrounds. If you're looking to be a bodybuilder, or if you're someone who just wants to optimize their genetic potential, having greater volumes is fairly well established now. There's been multiple meta-analyses that have shown this. So bottom line is that, yes, there's this dose response. The question is, at what point do you start seeing this plateau effect? And it's somewhat difficult to quantify. There's been some recent research with Zach Robinson's group. Probably somewhere around 10 sets per muscle seems to be where you're starting to get this leveling off, but that it continues well beyond that. It's just to get additional benefits, you need to do substantially more volume. So as you continue going on, you might have to do 5 more sets to eke out, an extra 1% difference. And that continues on. So again, we need more research on this. There hasn't been a ton at very high volumes, at least per muscle group. I'll give you some other personal perspectives here. The research on the topic, all of the studies on very high volumes have only looked at modest volumes for all of for the total amount of sets done during a week. So here's what I mean by that. We carried out a volume study where we had 1 set versus 3 sets versus 5 sets, and it came out to like in the quads, it was 18, or was it 9 versus 30 versus 45 sets for the quads. But the total number of sets for all the major muscle, for all the muscle groups, for all these sets that were done, was 105 sets. The total amount of training done during the week for the highest volume group was a little over 4 hours. So that most people on modest routines are doing, we had 90-second rest intervals, so it was somewhat of shorter rest periods, but it just was not a lot of total training, but there was a lot of focus training for muscle groups. And that, to me, and there's been a number of studies now, in addition to ours, multiple studies that have shown benefits to these somewhat higher volumes per muscle group. And I think the take home from that is the application of specialization cycles, whereas you can't necessarily extrapolate that if you did that volume for all the major muscle groups, that it potentially wouldn't have negative effects on overtraining, your ability to recover. But if you're doing that for selective muscle groups, let's say you have an overall, I like to think of it as a budget. So you have a certain number of sets that you do for all the exercises, well, all the major muscle groups throughout a given week, let's say, or a given time period. And then you apportion that volume based upon how well developed your muscles are. And my general, I don't want to say rule, but strategy is to go for no more than one or two specialization cycles for muscle groups. You might choose just the pecs, or maybe the pecs and the biceps, etc. And you focus your volume, the higher volumes for that, and then you got a maintenance volume for other muscles that are more well developed. And look, a bodybuilder wants symmetry. They want to build, evenness within their muscles, and obviously it's not good to have one muscle that's outshining another. You can maintain muscle with much lower volumes. I'd say that. And I'd also say, by the way, that the human body is very resilient. So for short periods of time, training is a stressor, volume is a stressor. The body can handle very high amounts of stress, but if you continue that over longer periods of time, it rapidly starts to break down. And that to me can lead to at least theory, and this has not been studied, but that having a periodized cycle where you do, let's say, a block of somewhat lower volume, then you go to a block of somewhat moderate volume, whether it's a month, 6 weeks, etc., and then a block of higher volume, and then you deload and repackage and do the same thing again. So these are all, I think, strategies. We do, by the way, have some good evidence within subject designs, unilateral designs, that there are responders and quote-unquote responders and non-responders to volume. Some people need more volume than others, and that's been, I think, fairly well documented. So some people can do quite well with lower volumes, where some people need to do more to optimize results, and that's where N=1 will always come in. You can only use research to provide general guidelines, and then everything has to be customized to your own individual needs and abilities.
Guys, training is infinitely more complicated than nutrition. Where do you start? How many reps? How many sets? How close to failure? If you're confused about where to start with training, but you don't have the money to hire a coach to expertly guide you, check out the BioLane Workout Builder. When you subscribe to the BioLane Workout Builder, you get access to all my evidence-based programming. We have programs for every experience level, goal, and equipment availability. We even have programs for people with essentially no equipment and home gyms or hotel gyms or garage gyms, all the way up to fully equipped commercial gyms. We take all the guesswork out of the reps, sets, and intensity, but give you the flexibility to pick exercises that you prefer and have access to, while still making sure that the exercises that you may sub in are equally effective for building muscle. So if you're ready to take the guesswork out of your training, get strong, and build muscle, click the link in the show notes and sign up to the BioLane Workout Builder today. So there's so much in there that I want to start picking at. The first thing I want to say is, like you said, there could be other mechanisms at play here. I think the difference is that volume and intensity, mechanical tension and volume, I guess mechanical tension just overall, because it's as you increase volume, you increase mechanical tension, encapsulates a lot of those other mechanistic details, which is, if you're doing a lot of mechanical tension, at some point, you're probably going to have some metabolic stress. If you're doing a lot of mechanical tension, you're probably going to create some muscle damage at some point. These are two other possible mechanisms that people have talked about for building muscle.
Greater hypoxia. There can be more hypoxia with muscle because you're compressing the vessels over longer periods of time. This is where we just don't have mechanisms are extremely difficult to study. As much as people think, that they are very pigeonholed into certain ways of thinking. Really, virtually all the mechanistic data we have is in rodent models, and most of it in vitro models that we're extrapolating to. So anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think that's why we really need to be cautious in trying to definitively take mechanisms and apply them into causal relationships with training strategies.
Well, that's why, I'm fond of the quote, which is, intensity is the drug and volume is the dosage, right? And you got to tweak depending on the individual. Now, unfortunately, as you pointed out, people hear that and they think, okay, well, if I just do more, I get a proportionate amount more. And what I want to emphasize to people is there are very few things in the body that work that way. Most of them, there's kind of this, I guess you would call it like a saturation effect. And even most medications work that way. At a certain point, with a certain dosage of medication, you kind of cap out the benefits. Only when it comes to resistance training, volume, protein intake, I feel strongly is this way as well. I'm not sure there's ever a hard cap. I'm not sure there's ever a point at which you just don't get any more benefits from more volume or more protein. I think the problem becomes at a certain point, the benefits are so infinitesimal, proportionate to the effort you're putting in, that it just probably doesn't make sense anymore based on limited practicality, right? So if I could do 200 sets a week for my entire body, I might get better results. But it's so marginal, most people aren't going to want to spend 3 or 4 hours a day in the gym to extract that last, 0.5%, 1%. I mean, we're throwing out numbers out there. And the same thing for protein. I mean, when I've looked at some of these research studies and when they do some meta-regressions, they basically, some of them show that there is no hard cap to protein intake in terms of its effects on net protein balance or muscle protein synthesis. If you get smaller studies, you can see a capping effect, but a lot of that is, I'm thinking of, years ago, Stu Phillips did a great study where they looked at egg albumin at 5, 10, 20, and 40 grams. And the conclusion was that the 20 grams maxed the response. Well, statistically, yes, but 40 grams still was 11% higher in muscle protein synthesis. So is there no difference, or is it there just wasn't enough subjects to be powered sufficiently to pick it out? Now, statisticians may cringe when I say that because you could kind of make that argument for a lot of different research studies, but I have seen this trend across studies. And so I think people, if you're familiar with like an asymptote, I think a lot of things look like this, which an asymptote is basically, so if I have an ascending asymptote, the first part of it is a very steep incline. Basically, that is your 1-to-1 ratio, right? Like, so from, again, Brad, we're going to hazard guesses here, but like maybe from 1 to 5 sets a week for a muscle group, you get like kind of a linear response. And then you start to slow down. Then you get to say 10 sets a week. And by that point, the curve is really smoothing out to where like when you were first adding a set, maybe you were getting, and again, I'm just tossing out numbers, 5% more hypertrophy for each set you're adding. Now you're getting, 0.25% for each set you're adding. And then as it goes up, now it's 0.1% and then 0.05%. And so it never goes to zero benefit. It just goes to such a small amount of benefit that it's, one, basically imperceptible to most people, and two, not worth the effort for most people. And so when I answer questions for people about building muscle, usually what I say is I will answer this 2 ways. The first way I'll answer it is for the person who just wants to build some muscle and look good, and what the research science says straight down the line, which is 10, 20 sets a week, you're completely capping it out for a body part. And then I'll tell you what I do, and because I want to be the most muscular, strongest human being I possibly can, I do more sets than that, right? And I eat more protein than what the cap says it is. But that's just me looking at it going, yeah, I do care about that 0.5 to 1% because I compete, right? I don't know what your thoughts are. If you agree with that kind of, I guess, theory would be, or hypothesis.
I do. In general, I would say as far as volume goes, though, that logically, at some point you're going to if you continue to do high volumes for long periods, very, very high volumes, and where that is, I can't say. There's no evidence on it. But at some point, there will be conceivably some overtraining. Now, I'll say this, in the literature, we don't see that. And even if you look at the old school bodybuilder training, like of the going back to the Schwarzenegger era. I mean, they were doing 20 hours a week in the gym. Ferrigno, suppose he was in 30 hours a week. Serge Nubret. Like a lot of these bodybuilders, they basically lived in the gym. And you could say, well, they were taking steroids. I don't know if that necessarily defeats overtraining. If anything, they're going to use heavier loads. So, but what I would say is that just logically, it would seem that at some point, if you're doing this for long periods of time, very high volumes could ultimately induce overtraining. But I certainly agree with your point that to the extent that it's not worth it for the vast majority of people, and I would even say with bodybuilders, and you start getting beyond a certain point, and I think this is, again, where inter-individual differences come into play, that some people would need a little more, and some people would need a little less, but that at some point it just becomes not worth doing more.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think the one thing to point out is, let's talk about overtraining real quick, because I think the perception is if I train past a certain point, my gains will be worse, that I will actually either lose muscle or not gain as much muscle. And what I'll tell people, so basically you're saying if I train past a certain point of recovery, it will have a catabolic effect. I don't think that's ever been shown in the literature, and I don't even know if that's a thing. I would kind of be surprised. I think overtraining negatively impacts hypertrophy in an indirect way, which is if you're overreaching or overtraining a lot, you're more likely to get injured, which is going to keep you out of the gym. You are going to lose drive and motivation to train, and you're just going to have some really crummy sessions, which might frustrate you and make you less likely to go in.
Yeah. So as you point out, so there's very good evidence of overtraining in aerobic training, where it's quite easy to do very marathon, ultra marathon running and doing a huge amount of volume duration. With resistance training, it's not been well shown. The studies on overtraining and resistance training generally are limited to doing 2 weeks straight every day. So basically 14 days straight of 10 sets of 1 RM. So doing 10 sets of 1 RM, day 1, day 2, day 3. And yeah, you start to see these symptoms that you're talking about. And basically it manifests, I would think the issue in terms of hypertrophy, which we don't have evidence as to the effects on hypertrophy, but you start seeing reductions in performance. And you would assume that if you're having negative effects on performance, that would translate into negative effects on hypertrophy, deceivably. And if you don't have the desire to get into the gym, as you point out, if you're getting lethargy, if you're getting sick, which happens because your immune system is suppressed, it's just not a good recipe. So we can, I think, logically extrapolate that would have negative effects. But you're correct that the phenomenon of overtraining and resistance training has not been certainly well established in the literature.
So I think take home from that is, and I do agree with you. I think you've got an overall budget in terms of number of sets for your body. Now, I do want to point out, overtraining is not a static number for an individual. You can train your body to recover from more. In fact, I remember back when I used to train legs once a week, this is back in 2003, and I was on a message board called Mind and Muscle. And a really smart guy who I still keep in touch with was like, well, the protein synthetic response to training is 48 to 72 hours. Just makes sense to me that you would train, multiple times a week. Why don't you try training your legs twice a week if they're not growing? And I was like, I can't do that. When I train my legs, they're sore for a week. How would I ever train them twice a week? He said, you are sore for a week because you give your body a week. If you started training them twice a week, what you would find is you'd be less sore. And I'm like, this is nonsense. This is crazy. Ended up doing it. And sure enough, at first I was very, very sore. And then over the course of about a month, my usual, recovery, which would be, 5-6 days for my legs to stop being sore, went down to 2 or 3 days. And then, at a certain point, especially in my heyday of powerlifting, when I was squatting 3 to 4 times a week and deadlifting 2 to 3 times a week, my legs didn't really get sore at all. I just had kind of a deep bone ache is the best way to describe it. So yeah, I just want to point that out because I think some people think, well, past this set number, it's overtraining. And no, if your nutrition is on point, if your sleep's good, if your stress is low, you don't have a lot of other obligations, you can really like train with a lot of volume and recover from it. In fact, probably the best female powerlifter in the world, maybe the best powerlifter in the world, is Agata Sitko from Poland. This gal basically enters weight classes at the very bottom end of the weight class and then destroys everybody just to toy with them. She was getting interviewed and she basically gets a stipend from the Polish government to train. She trains like 5 to 6 hours a day. And she's like doing compound movements. Like I think the minimum frequency she trains with on a lift is 3 times a week. And most of them she trains almost daily. So when you've got all that set up, you can recover from a lot. And so I just want to point that out, that it's not a static number. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, like repeated bout effect or those sorts of things.
Totally agree. And at the end, so we do studies all the time, obviously. And usually they're 8 or 10 weeks. In the first couple of weeks, so soreness generally is in response to a novel stimulus. And it can be when you don't train for a period of time, that again could be interpreted somewhat as a novel stimulus, because if you're waiting a full week to train the same muscle group, that there's novelty in that response. But certainly our training sessions are a minimum of twice a week, same muscle groups. And in the first couple of weeks, we train them really hard. They're generally not used to the range of motion that we do, etc. Virtually all of them get sore week 1, week 2, maybe somewhat week 3. By the end, we ask at the end of the study, literally no one is sore. Because there's a repeated bout effect. And the repeated bout effect starts after the first session. So if you do one session, you will get a large attenuation. And soreness, by the way, is not highly correlated with the muscle damage, but it's a symptomatic effect of muscle damage. There's other factors that are believed to be in play. But you're going to see that's where your main muscle damage or edema is going to come in after the first session. It then rapidly attenuates, and after 2 to 3 weeks, you see very little, and certainly after 6 to 8 weeks, there's zero.
Yeah, very interesting. So you brought up muscle damage. So and I talked about metabolic stress a little bit. Those are 2 other kind of mechanisms that get thrown around for hypertrophy. So I want to bring this all together. How important do we think those might be for hypertrophy and soreness? Should we be worried about being sore? Like, should we be trying to be sore? How important are these things for hypertrophy?
Yeah, so good questions. And I published my capstone project for my master's degree. It was published in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. It was called The Mechanisms of Muscle Hypertrophy and Their Application of Resistance Training. And it was published in 2010. And I never would have thought the impact that paper had. It has now almost 2,400 citations. It's been cited by almost 2,400 other papers. And it's just amazing to me. But it's a very dated paper at this point. My views have changed. But look, the understanding of mechanisms is a very slow process, as I mentioned earlier. So we do have certainly a lot more knowledge than we had back when I was doing that. And I was written 16, 17 years ago. So I would say this, muscle damage, my main thought with muscle damage, well, I'll say this, if you have severe muscle damage, it's going to be a negative. So if you're walking out of the gym like you're Frankenstein and you're, barely able to walk, you're stiff, you're not going to be able to train properly. And if you can't train properly, it's going to have negative effects on muscle development. So that's a net negative. My thought was, at least hypothesis, was that, well, maybe there's this sweet spot that if you got mild to moderate muscle damage, there's various factors. And again, I don't know how deep you want to get into this, but muscle damage has been shown to promote satellite cell activation. Satellite cells are highly involved in the anabolic processes and hypertrophy, particularly as people get on and on closer to their genetic ceiling, are more well-trained. It increases the production of what are called macrophages, which are substances that have been implicated in the hypertrophic process, and some other factors. What's been shown in more recent research is that generally over the increase in satellite cell activation and macrophages are really only associated with severe muscle damage and not mild to moderate muscle damage, certainly not mild. So it kind of takes away that potential avenue and makes me more skeptical that muscle damage is involved. But there's other factors. There's some evidence that muscle damage is involved in longitudinal hypertrophy, meaning the addition of sarcomeres in series. There's the arachidonic acid pathway, which is part of the COX pathway that's blunted by non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, and that's been shown. Well, when you take non-steroidal anti-inflammatories in young individuals, been shown to have negative effects. So could increasing this pathway? So again, I don't dismiss that muscle damage may be involved. I also will say that very mild muscle damage, I think, is obligatory. That meaning that it has to happen if you are training hard. It might not manifest in something you could see. So even microscopically, I'm not sure. But you have to have some perturbations of tissue. So could it just be permissive? I think these are things that still are somewhat need to be better elucidated. But I put less stock in the potential effect of muscle damage. Metabolic stress is more interesting. It's been shown that there's dozens of metabolites. First of all, there's thousands of metabolites, but there's dozens that are produced specific to resistance training, and most of them have not been studied as far as their signaling capabilities. The one that has been most studied has been lactate. Lactate is part of lactic acid, and it has conflicting evidence. There's some evidence, particularly in rodent models and particularly in vitro, that it's quite anabolic. There's other evidence in vivo, meaning in the living. So and these are all animal models. There's some that shows there is a benefit. There's others that show when you actually involve resistance training that it doesn't have a synergistic effect. We had one study in humans that showed no effect, but they basically injected lactate into the bloodstream, which is, I don't put much stock in the study. It's interesting. To me, these are all interesting, but if it's a signaling agent, which lactate, by the way, has been well documented to signal other tissue, the brain, it's involved in signaling of multiple tissues, you need to have it in the muscle to carry out the signaling effects, and I'm not sure how it's getting to the muscle through the bloodstream. So again, lactate, I think, is an interesting area, and there's receptors that are associated with lactate that have been implicated in muscle hypertrophy. So again, people are quick to dismiss it. I think that's misguided, and there's people that are, I think, too quick to accept it. I would say on the spectrum of my confidence, I'm not confident at all, but I don't dismiss it. And I certainly think there's other metabolites that are potentially involved. I think hypoxia is a very interesting area. So there's some evidence that when you train under acute hypoxic conditions, meaning that and by the way, hypoxia also is involved in blood flow restriction training because it's reducing oxygen to the muscle. These are all things that I think have potential relevance, particularly in downstream effects and their signaling capabilities. But if you're asking me, am I highly confident of it? Definitely not. Would I be surprised if it had an effect? No. Would I be surprised if it didn't? No. So that's my uncertainty in this.
And I think when we look at the mechanotransduction of you lift weights to muscle is built, there are a lot of mechanisms that are likely at play. And some mechanisms may only be important in the presence of other things going on. I'm thinking about like some of the classes I took in exercise immunology where they're like, well, this inflammatory cytokine is inflammatory, but also anti-inflammatory when this is present. And this is regulatory, but only when these other things are low. And you like start trying to like unpack this symphony in your head. And you're like, I don't know which way is up and down. And I think you mentioned something casually in talking that I think is worth circling back to. Okay, so when we're dealing with mechanisms, if we're talking about an outcome, so an outcome is muscular hypertrophy. So that's a whole body physiological outcome. That's a hard outcome. We can measure it. Yes, there are mechanisms that explain this outcome, but you have to think about mechanisms as there are thousands of mechanisms that are happening all at the same time. It is the summation of those signals that leads to whatever the outcome is. And so when you resistance train, a great example of this, if you resistance train, there are catabolic pathways that get activated. In fact, when you resistance train, muscle synthesis goes up, but degradation goes up too. So if I just wanted to pick out muscle degradation and say, well, you don't want to resistance train, it's going to cause you to break down muscle, because it does, but it also causes you to synthesize it. And so we're looking at the summation of these signals. And to your point about muscular damage, we don't see large or significant increases in hypertrophy through the first few weeks of training. And that corresponds to the highest amounts of muscle damage. And actually, when we see synthesis start to really go up and hypertrophy start to grow up is when the damage starts to fall off. So it almost appears like there's this initial phase of just remodeling the tissue to prep for being able to grow more muscle. Now, I don't know if that's an actual thing, but that's kind of what I see happening. And just to put a bow on the idea of, I want people to think about muscular hypertrophy occurs in the correct environment for muscular hypertrophy. And just to point this out, you mentioned something about non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. When they gave NSAIDs in high doses in young people, it inhibited muscle protein synthesis and inhibited muscular hypertrophy. But when they gave it to old people, they actually, I believe, they actually saw a benefit to hypertrophy. Now, people will go, what the heck's going on? Well, what that suggests is older people have more inflammation. They have more reactive oxygen species. What it suggests is there is a optimal range of inflammation and oxidative stress where muscular hypertrophy flourishes. And if you get too low in that range, it's a negative for hypertrophy. You get too high in that range, it's a negative for hypertrophy. And I think a lot of things in the body work this way. So there is a range where this milieu is, I guess, optimized or tuned up for muscular hypertrophy. And we can go through the mechanisms, we can talk about them, they're cool. But at the end of the day, here's what we seem to have a good idea of, which is you need a proper amount of intensity, get close enough to failure, do enough volume in terms of the number of hard sets. And if you do similar intensity, similar volume, regardless of how you get there, it seems to produce very similar results.
Yeah, I actually have somewhat of a different take from the explanatory effect of the old versus the young. To me, it is more the older individuals have chronic low-grade inflammation. And the reduction by NSAIDs, at least this is the working theory that has been proposed, where the blunting of chronic low-grade inflammation outweighs the positive effects of there's an acute inflammatory response that is done. So when
to point out, Brad, that is again going back to the summation of mechanisms, right? Because you're having, if you're right, so let's say that your interpretation is right and mine is incorrect. But if you're right, it means that, okay, whatever negative from taking these NSAIDs on the training-induced inflammatory response, it is outweighed by the positive on the basal levels of inflammation. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to point out that this is in line with what we're both saying. So please continue on that.
Exactly. And by the way, you also brought up reactive oxygen species, same exact thing. So chronic so basically when you chronically have these free radicals floating around in your body, especially due to smoking, et cetera, and other pollutants, net negative effect on health as well as everything. But there's been really interesting evidence that when you take high doses of antioxidants or supplementation with vitamin C and E, it actually blunts the hypertrophic response because the acute upregulation of reactive oxygen species seems to be involved. At least there's evidence that it activates anabolic pathways. So yeah, to your point exactly. And that there's this balance between if you're having let's say a lot of low-grade inflammation, blunting that has supersedes the net negative effect on blunting the acute response. And that's why we need to be very careful. By the way, cortisol, as much as people talk about that as the boogeyman of catabolic processes, it is actually correlated with muscle hypertrophy from an acute standpoint. So the acute upregulation is probably the only hormone that's been shown, at least to my knowledge, that has shows a relationship.
Yeah, I discussed this with Stu Phillips. I remember there's been a few papers that have come out that kind of fundamentally changed how I thought about a lot of things in nutrition and training. And he published one that was a review called Muscle Growth or Muscular Hypertrophy is an Intrinsic Process. And they went over a lot of the data, and they actually did a cohort of men who resistance trained, and they looked at growth hormone, they looked at IGF-1, they looked at testosterone, they looked at cortisol, which I believe this is the study you're referring to. And they looked at 1 rep max strength, they looked at hypertrophy or lean mass, they looked at cross-sectional area. And none of the hormones were associated with hypertrophy except cortisol. And I remember pointing this out to people, and Brad, you mentioned it too in passing. A lot of scientists don't get this point, which there is a big difference between an acute truncated response of a hormone or a signaling or a signal cascade versus chronic. Those are big, big differences. And just to highlight this, Brad, if you didn't know anything about exercise, but you knew general health stuff, and I said, Brad, I'm going to have you do something that is going to damage your muscle. It's going to increase your free radical production, increase your inflammatory marker production, raise your heart rate, raise your blood pressure, and raise your cortisol. What would you say to me?
Sign me up.
But you know already.
Obviously, that would be, for someone not knowing that, I'd say, boy, that's something that's really catabolic to your body. You're putting your body through an effector that's going to have ultimately lead to negative effects. And we, as you point out, know that is not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best way to describe it is exercise is kind of like a vaccine. You're giving your body a controlled dose of a stressor, and your body gets better at handling that stressor, which is why I lose my mind, Brad, when I see these cortisol coaches who are telling people, oh, don't exercise like this or at this time because it raises cortisol. And my thoughts are, yeah, well, cortisol is the only hormone that's associated with hypertrophy, so sign me up. Like if we're looking at that. And people don't understand the difference between acute and long-term. Most things acute, I'm not really too concerned. If you're going by acute stuff, you can't eat anything because protein raises mTOR and, in the short term, and mTOR is associated with cancer. Can't eat carbs because they raise blood glucose, and blood glucose is toxic to your blood vessels. So you can't eat carbs. Also, glucose raises your inflammatory markers in the short term. Also, can't eat fat because fat impedes flow-mediated dilation, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. The difference is these are all short-term things that don't persist, but if you want to worry about short-term truncated responses, then I guess sit out in the sun and hope for photosynthesis and see what happens,
And by the way, resistance training also increases AMPK production. So AMPK is a catabolic enzyme, which is supposed to be the boogeyman. It directly opposes the production of mTOR, the activation of mTOR. So when you resistance train, if that's the case, you shouldn't be able to build muscle. And obviously that doesn't transpire.
And that's the problem with these people who pick out mechanisms online and try to scare you over them, is because when you're taking an isolated mechanism, it doesn't say anything. I mean, another great example is aspirin. Aspirin, we know, is an anticoagulant. That's why they tell people who've had heart attacks or whatever, hey, take a baby aspirin every day. It's an anticoagulant. But it also activates procoagulant pathways as well. But the net effect is that the activation of the anticoagulant pathways are stronger, and thus it is an anticoagulant. But I could construct an argument based on the influencer model of why aspirin is a procoagulant, or resistance training is going to make you lose muscle. Like you could literally find mechanistic studies to support whatever you want. And the way I always describe this to people is it's like a mutual fund versus an individual stock. Okay. Mutual funds are made up of dozens, if not hundreds, of small pieces of individual stocks. Now, Brad, I could come to you and say, Brad, you don't want to invest in this mutual fund. Look at these 2 stocks that are down by 50% this year, while neglecting to tell you that overall the mutual fund is up by 25%. What do I care more about? The 2 stocks that are down, or the fact that overall this fund is killing it? I mean, sign me up. Like, I care that overall it's killing it. And so when I get really, angry on my social media about mechanisms versus outcomes, I'm like, look, I love mechanisms. And if you have an outcome, there are mechanisms to explain it. But just because a mechanism exists doesn't mean it's going to produce an outcome. Hey guys, Lane here. And if you listen to my podcast, you probably love my research breakdowns. I don't put in a bunch of unnecessary fluff and scientific mumbo jumbo. I just give you the straight facts, but keep the nuance. And so if you love my research breakdowns, you'll love my research review reps. Research explained with practical summaries. Every month, my team of experts breaks down 5 studies in nutrition and fitness in a way that is palatable and easy to understand, even if you don't have a scientific degree. We tell you what the researchers tested, how they tested it, what they found, and what it means for you. And if we disagree with the researchers' conclusions based on their own data, we'll also tell you that. There's no BS, there's no fluff. We give you the straight facts. So if you're looking to up-level your brain and body gains, click the link in the show notes. Getting back to volume, why does the research seem so contradictory when it comes to volume? I mean, you got some people say, well, look at this study, 1 set versus 3 sets, 1 set versus 5 sets, no difference. Whereas we have multiple meta-analyses that say, well, volume does seem to matter, that there is some dose response. How do we explain these differences?
Yeah, so I'm not sure contradictory would be the word I would use here. So if it was contradictory, you would have stuff. So basically, when you carry out a meta-analysis, you provide what's called a forest plot. And each study is listed, and it shows the effect. And basically, you have the 0 line, and everything to the right, let's say with volume, would show benefit to higher volumes. Everything to the left would show benefit to lower volumes. If the research was truly contradictory, you would have a bunch of studies on the left showing benefit to lower volumes, bunch of studies on the right showing benefit to higher volumes, or some, and then most of them probably centered around the 0 line. That's not what we see. We see that really in our meta-analysis, and this is our meta-analysis goes back now 8 years, but even with all the other studies, and there's been quite a few since, there really is no studies showing a benefit to lower volume training. I can't recall one in all the studies, and we have several dozen studies now. But you have some that show no tangible benefit, or they're right around that 0 line. And we have others that show a clear benefit. And that's what you generally see if there's a benefit to something. But the benefit is not, it's somewhat indiscriminate. You're not sure where it is. And that's really due to what's called sampling variance. And I think this is another thing that needs to be understood by the general public. When we do resistance training studies, they are extremely time intensive. So let's say we're doing a study, we have 50 subjects in a group, which is generally our norm for parallel designs. They're training 3 days a week. That's 150 man in 1 hour, let's say 1 hour training sessions, 150 man hours every week over the course of a 10-week study, well over 1,000 hours. And that doesn't include the testing that's done pre and post study. So you're up to like 1,500 man hours. Huge. Our studies involve 12 to 15 research assistants that are students that are, it's not just one, you can never carry that out with 1 or 2 students to have properly, decently powered studies, and they're still somewhat small studies. So 50 subjects, we end up, there's 20% dropout rate on average. You're ending up with 44 subjects. There's going to be what's called sampling variance, where if you take that, basically a sample is a portion of the population that you want to study. So if you want to study resistance trained individuals, you're going to take a sample. If I take this sample and then do a study, they're going to get different results. Then they'll pick a different sample. And there's noise within the modality that we're using. Let's say ultrasound or MRI, whatever is being used for measuring muscle growth. all of these things need to be considered, and you're going to almost always see somewhat of a discrepancy in terms of some studies. It's very difficult to show that have adequately powered studies to show a large effect. So you're going to see these smaller effects that really wouldn't be borne out unless you had 200, 100, 200 subjects, and that would mean you're doing 3,000 man hours or more over the course of the study. So anyway, the bottom line is with the volume studies, we don't have studies that are showing a negative effect of volume. We have, probably half or so that are showing a positive effect to some extent, some more than others. And this is where where it's difficult to, in a field that requires such intensive man-hour intensive research, it's difficult to really get pinned down a magnitude of effect. And particularly until you have a huge number of studies that are able to be meta-analyzed. And it's why meta-analyses are so important, because if you're looking at someone could choose an isolated study, which is done all the time by influencers that want to show the given outcome, and they'll pick I could cherry pick any study for virtually any topic and show something that would be counterintuitive to what the body of literature shows.
To really put a bow on that point, Brad, I use this example all the time. I pulled up a meta-analysis of smoking on the risk of adenocarcinoma. And to the right is increased risk, to the left is decreased risk, and obviously the center line is a neutral risk. And there was like almost 50 studies in this meta-analysis. Now, the overall effect of smoking on the risk of adenocarcinoma, I think, was like a 300 to 700% increased risk of adenocarcinoma. So that's the take home. But there were two studies that were to the left of the line, right? So there's two studies that they weren't statistically significant, but showed a slightly protective effect of smoking on adenocarcinoma. So if I pick those out, and then I'll also say, smoking, people who smoke have a 40% lower risk of Parkinson's. Well, I could make smoking seem like it's a good idea, right? And that's why consensus is so important when it comes to the research literature. And I think people really miss this stuff. And I use a similar analysis. I really like what you said about the data isn't contradictory, because the data shows it is either a neutral or positive effect of increased volume on hypertrophy. When I'm explaining like saturated fat, the risk of cardiovascular disease with people who are anti-seed oil, because they say, seed oils or polyunsaturated fats are bad for your heart, et cetera, et cetera. I say, okay, well, show me the studies. And they're always mechanistic in animals and whatnot. And then when you pull up the human studies, what they'll do is they'll shift the goalpost, which is, well, look at this meta-analysis. And they pull out a meta-analysis of like short randomized control trials that show no difference in cardiovascular disease outcomes over a couple years of saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat. I'm like, no. Your claim was that polyunsaturated fats are bad for you. So where's this data? Because all you showed was a neutral effect. And I can pull up quite a few meta-analyses that show a positive effect of replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. So no, the data is not contradictory. There is either a neutral or positive effect, which means you are not losing anything by replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, and you're probably gaining something. And again, that's just one of those things where, unfortunately, for people watching these sorts of debates, they'll think somebody's made a good point because they've already forgotten their original point, which was, well, this thing's bad for you. No, showed it wasn't bad for you. Okay, well, it's not good for you. It's like, no, that wasn't your original claim. So I think very similarly about this, and I'm really glad you brought that up, that it's not really contradictory. It's either neutral or positive when it comes to hypertrophy. Is frequency, some people, there's kind of two different thought processes when it comes to frequency. Some people have basically said frequency is just a means to distribute volume. It doesn't seem to have an effect on hypertrophy. And other people have said, well, kind of like I said earlier, protein synthetic response to training is only about 48 to 72 hours. So it makes sense that you'd want multiple stimulations over the course of a week. Where do you stand on training frequency when it comes to muscular hypertrophy?
Yeah, I kind of agree with the former points you made, that it probably is just a way of distributing volume. So I think the evidence, the current evidence that we have seems to show that up to around 10 sets per muscle per session, it really doesn't matter whether you're doing it in one session, two sessions, or more. Whereas when you start getting above 10, 12 sets per muscle per session, there seems to be a benefit of distributing the volume out over more frequent sessions. So, for instance, if you're going to do a chest workout on Monday, because of course Monday is National Chest Day, and you're going to do 16 sets, you're probably better off doing 8 sets on Monday and 8 sets, let's say, on Thursday or Friday. So giving that some time for in between the sessions. And it could be because of the muscle protein synthetic response. It could be that there's a cap to what the muscle protein synthetic response can have in a given session, but there doesn't seem to be an effect, at least over let's say a week's time, of the muscle protein synthetic response, of spacing that out. So doing more frequent sessions for that purpose. By the way, there was the very well, or at least popular study called the Norwegian Frequency Project. I don't know if you recall that study.
Yes, I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember the kind of general vibe of the study.
So long story short, it was done in Norway, who has the best, or one of the best powerlifting teams. They're a country of 6 million people, and they compete well against, the U.S. was 300 plus million. Anyway, they took their powerlifters, and they, actually, they're some very well-trained powerlifters, and they had them do the same volume, but one group did it over 6 days, so 2 sets and they were squats, deadlifts, and bench press. The other group did 4 sets 3 days a week, and the group that did 4 sets 3 days a week had no growth, and then MRI. I mean, it was very gold standard measures. And the group that did the 6 days a week, spreading it out more, had 5 to 10% growth. And it was so that sounds like, hey, sign me up for doing 6 days a week of training. Couple caveats: that number one, the study was never published. I asked when I was in Norway and I was speaking there, and I asked the lead researcher on it why, and he said, well, you don't want people knowing about the secrets of the Norwegian powerlifting team. And I was like, it kind of didn't make sense, because everyone knows. I said, well, everyone knows about the study. You did a bad job in hiding that.
They actually published. If you got an abstract or you're putting it at a conference, people know.
He published it as an abstract too, so it didn't make sense. And the other thing, when he started telling me that they used the powerlifting routines, they were well short of failure. So it was a different type of routine. It was more designed for powerlifting purposes, for strength. And he said to me that, yeah, this is the routine we do for strength. He goes, but for hypertrophy, we do less frequency and higher volume. So anyway, long story short, and it was replicated and did not show the same results in more ecologically valid contexts, including in our group. So the bottom line is that frequency seems to be a good way to distribute higher volumes. But I think if you're doing moderate to lower volume, somewhere 10 sets per session, 12 sets max or less, probably is not going to make a difference whether you're doing it all in one session or splitting it up. As long as if you're doing that once every 2 or 3 weeks, I think that probably would be of issue. But in the studies that we have, they're at least once a week versus more than once a week, and doesn't seem to be much difference.
Yeah, I've changed my thought process on this. I used to think frequency was really important, and I do think it's actually important for strength. I think for strength, because you're getting more practice with a specific lift, I think that matters. But for hypertrophy, I do agree that I think the majority of the benefits of increased frequency it's just an easier way to distribute volume. And if you're going to do, I do think once you get up in higher volumes, like 20 to 40 sets a week for a body part, one, it just becomes not really feasible to do it in one session and have quality sets continuing because of the fatigue that accumulates. But two, from a time perspective, it just becomes impractical. And I do think at that point, there is some evidence that there's kind of a capping or plateauing of the muscle protein synthetic response around 10 to 12 sets in a session. So I do think if you're getting on like higher end range of those volumes, maybe there's a benefit that's unique to frequency, but I think, I think about this as like a hierarchy, right? Like the most important thing is just getting enough intensity and volume throughout the week and the training cycle. And then if you can distribute it a little bit more evenly across a few days, might get a little bit better results. Now I want to ask you about range of motion. How important is range of motion? There's some people out on social media, Joel Seaman. Sorry, I have like an allergy or something. Who they say, well, you want to not do full range of motion. It's bad for your joints. It's going to cause you to get injured. Just go to 90 degrees on a joint angle. That's optimal. And then you have people who are like, you got to train full ROM. That's how you create the muscle growth. And then we have people doing lengthened partials. So where do you stand on this debate? What are your thoughts on range of motion?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that there's been quite a number of studies now that have looked at lengthened partials versus shortened partials. So basically doing the movement from the, let's say, bicep curl, your starting position where your arms are extended to halfway up, kind of like the first part of a 21, if you've ever done that. And the shortened partial would be the last part of the 21. This can be done in most joints. The overwhelming, I would say, body of evidence at this point suggests that the shortened partial is suboptimal to lengthened partial when you're just comparing partials, which would indicate that the lengthened portion of the movement is the most important aspect of the training, of the range of motion. Now, when you're comparing lengthened partials versus full range of motion, the evidence is somewhat equivocal, but in my opinion, my reading of the literature, it probably doesn't make it. Interestingly, it's not negative. You'd assume that if full range of motion should be better. That is not the case. Actually, the lengthened partial shows similar results to the full range of motion, which again, to me, emphasizes the importance of doing the lengthened portion. However, there is a well-documented strength effect. Basically training range of motion has a range-oriented effect, a specificity effect on strength. So roughly within 15 degrees or so of a given joint angle will be the optimal transfer of strength. And when you start getting beyond that, you will lose it. And we have a recent paper that was just published that really documented this quite nicely. And that to me, so certainly from a strength standpoint, you want to train through a full range to have proper full range transfer on a general basis. Now, if you want to focus on a given strength range, there also can be benefits to doing the partial within that given range. And by the way, that could be a shortener. If you're, let's say, looking for a basketball player looking to maximize jump height you're not going to go into a full squat to rebound. So you'd want to focus on that short range. But that doesn't mean that all your training should be done in that range either. People kind of have this all or none mentality. But I'd say this, that we're talking hypertrophy now, my default would be on a general basis to doing full range of motion, but I would say that at least there's the possibility that adding in some lengthened partials may enhance the effect. We don't have data to show that. We do have some data showing that doing it as a set extender, so let's say going to failure and when you're not able to get full range of motion reps, just doing, let's say, chest, doing some lengthened partials, in that lengthened portion, which you can get out some extra reps, may have a hypertrophic benefit. One study, is that the be-all end-all? No, you need multiple studies. But I always defer to the strategy that everything is cost benefit. And if something does not seem to have a negative effect or potentially has a positive effect, it's worth trying and seeing how it goes. So I would say that is a strategy. My general recommendation is the majority of training should be done through full range and that potentially adding in some lengthened partials. I would also add, by the way, it may be muscle specific. So there's some indication that the calves may benefit more through lengthened partials than certain other muscles, basically based on where it's whether it sits on the ascending or descending limb of the length-tension relationship. So we don't know. To me, I think that's one of the problems with hypertrophy research. It's very difficult to get torso, the pecs. We have some, the lats, there's zero, the delts, there's very little. So mostly we're dealing with the limbs, the arms, and the legs. And I do think that based on the current evidence we have, that would be my general recommendation, that the majority is full range, and potentially adding in some lengthens may help to enhance the effect.
Yeah, and I'm on the same page here. I think my take home from all this research is that perhaps the stretch is also part of mechanical tension in some way, that when you're increasing the stretch of the muscle, that is more tension on the muscle. And my take home from all this research is it is important to take the muscle into a stretched position under load. That is an important part of hypertrophy. So that's kind of my take home from everything.
So agreed. And by the way, I mentioned earlier, that's where the passive tension comes in. So mechanical tension has two components, an active and a passive. When you are in the stretch position, you are increasing the passive elements, passive stretch. And interestingly, the passive tension, at least theoretically, the current theory is that they are regulated by different anabolic pathways, which would seem to indicate there may be synergistic effects. So there's certain pathways that are specific to active tension and certain pathways that seem to be more relevant to passive tension. And thus, by combining them, there may be this synergistic effect.
Okay, next question. These next ones are going to be some quicker ones. Are there any intensity techniques out there or tricks, quote unquote, that produce more hypertrophy, or is it really just have intense training and do enough number of hard sets? Or is there any kind of tricks in there that can help people?
Yeah, the one that seems the intensification technique that seems to show the greatest potential benefit is accentuated eccentric overload, basically taking a supramaximal load and lowering it under control. There's some evidence that may promote a greater hypertrophic response or an additive hypertrophic response. Other intensification techniques such as supersets, drop sets, rest pause do not show benefits, but they do show the ability to have greater time efficiency. So they show similar hypertrophy, and there's issues in trying to equate volume, so that these are other things that we're just not sure how to implement them. And could they be implemented as set extenders at the end of the last set, like a drop set? We don't have good evidence on this. So there's other potential ways that I can make a case. They may have beneficial effects, and I think it's worth experimenting. But overall, I think they do provide the ability to get out of the gym more quickly. And for a lot of people, time is the limiting factor, the greatest barrier to being able to adhere to training. We just finished, here's a scoop for you, one of my students, Sam Herman, former students now, just finished his thesis, which is in review, but we looked at the pre-exhaust superset, which is a single joint exercise followed by a multi-joint for the same muscle group. So let's say a leg extension followed by a squat. And the idea is that the limiting factor in the squat is the lower back, and that before your quads give out, your lower back will, if you can pre-fatigue the quads, you would be able to conceivably fail or come close to failure in your quads before your lower back gives out. Did not work out that way. It actually wasn't a huge difference, but there was a suggestion of somewhat of an attenuated, a diminished hypertrophic response in the pre-exhaust, and thus I would not, even though they did complete it in much less time, and I think the rationale, we did look at volume load. The volume load was much less in the pre-exhaust group, so seemingly it could have been because of an attenuation of volume load.
Yeah, I think my take home I tell people is when you equate volume and intensity between protocols, there's very few things out there that seem to make a difference. And like you said, maybe these eccentric overloads could be something, but we need a lot more evidence. And again, even when you're talking about like set extenders or like lengthened partials at the end of the set, well, now you're not equating volume anymore, right? So it does become difficult to tease apart these things. But my favorite intensity technique is opposing body part supersets, right? Like if I'm If I'm doing a chest exercise, if I have the means to do so, why wouldn't I do a back exercise in between sets? Because I'm resting, especially like on a bench press or something like that. I'm usually resting on my big lifts, upwards of 5 minutes, for powerlifting, because one, I'm used to that kind of rep or that kind of set rest period from competing. And two, it's very like psychologically taxing as well to get completely focused to execute the reps properly. So if I'm going to rest 3 to 5 minutes, why not go get another set in on something else? Because my lung capacity is not diminished or anything like that. I just think it's a good time-saving benefit. I don't think there's any extra benefit you get from it. But hey, if I can cut 30% of the time off my workout by doing it, why wouldn't I want to do it?
Yeah, we had a recent study and it showed exactly that.
Yeah. Okay, how much does rep cadence matter? Like the speed at which you do your reps, does that matter for hypertrophy?
Yeah, I'll give you another scoop. We have a meta-analysis in review that looked at the effect on eccentric actions and on concentric actions, the tempo. So it's really before we had a previous meta-analysis that was carried out years ago, but there just wasn't much data at that time, and we did total rep duration. So basically 2 up, 4 down would be the same as 4 up, 2 down. And that there's problems in trying to extrapolate that. Here we actually looked at just the concentric action and just the eccentric action. And basically the results were quite similar. However, it's basically meaning that there was no effect of repetition tempo. Somewhat interestingly, there was a slight benefit, didn't reach quote unquote statistical, what I would call statistical relevance, but somewhat of a benefit to somewhat faster concentric actions. And somewhat to my surprise, I would have thought that a somewhat, so not very slow, but at least a somewhat slower eccentric action would have promoted somewhat greater hypertrophy. That did not seem independent of that. Now, that's what I will say. I would assume it's difficult to tell, like, what is 1 second down? Did they actually time it? It wasn't clear. Some of these, if you just let the weight drop where there's no muscle tension under gravity, I would certainly assume that would have a negative effect. So the extrapolation that I would have, as long as you are controlling the eccentric action, even if it's fairly rapidly, so the muscle is doing the work, that it really doesn't matter. Again, we don't have a ton. There was, I think, a total of 12 studies, if I recall, and I think 4 of them were concentric, 8 of them eccentric. So we're not dealing with a huge amount of literature at this point. And this is why people think that we just have this huge body of literature and we can get all the answers. And it's why when we talked about having certainty, having relative certainty in our opinions, you can't have high degrees of certainty without a large body of evidence. It's not until you're starting to get many, many, many studies that can really have that you can really have a high certainty of confidence in your opinion.
Yeah, I remember this first meta-analysis. I think the take-home was anywhere between 2 to 8 seconds of a total rep cadence produces similar hypertrophy. If you get outside those extremes, then it seems to produce less hypertrophy. What I tell people typically is, hey, control the eccentric so that you're not just dropping it. But you can go relatively quickly on an eccentric as long as you're controlling it. And then concentric, you should be moving it as quickly as you possibly can. And my rationale for that is higher force production. And again, like people will try to make arguments, like there was a style training called super slow. I don't think it's as popular now, but it was popular like back in the 80s, really popular. And there was a study that came out, and I may butcher the details, but I'll get the general right. And I'm sure you'll know the study I'm talking about. I think they were looking at curls, and they had people do like 6 seconds up and 6 seconds down versus just a normal rep cadence. And they found that the slow tempo was better for hypertrophy. But here's where you got to read the details of a study to know the difference. They had them do the same number of reps, which guess what? The group doing slow up, slow down, I think they got like around 10 reps before failure. Well, if you just do 10 reps at a normal pace, you're not even close to failure. And so when you standardize for failure, then they don't see any differences. And the reality is people want to make a big deal about time under tension. But if I do 6 up, 6 down in terms of repetition cadence, and I can only do 10 reps, but I do a normal cadence and I can do 22, 23, 24, 25 reps, guess what my total time during that set's going to look like? They're going to probably look pretty similar before I actually hit muscular failure. So my take home is that I think rep cadence matters very little unless you're doing it really, really fast or really, really slow.
Yeah, I would agree. And there were not any super slow studies that met our criteria because they had to control if you did a certain number, let's say 2 seconds versus 6 seconds concentric, they had to have the same eccentric contraction. And there were no super slow. Basically, with super slow, it's modifying both of those actions, both the eccentric and concentric. But there was a study by Robert Staron's group, this is probably 15 years ago now, but they actually looked at the true super slow was 10 up, 4 down. So 10 seconds up, 4 seconds down versus 1 second up, 2 seconds down. And they actually looked at fiber type specific hypertrophy. So they did biopsies, and it was a pretty stark, interestingly, a pretty stark difference, superiority for the faster group, where it showed, I think the super slow group gained, if I recall, something like 10% increases, and it was like 30 something percent for the 1 up, 2 down group. And they were, again, it said both were going to failure. So that it would suggest, first of all, it certainly suggests that there's no benefit. Kind of the whole super slow is based on the theory that reducing quote unquote momentum is going, which is biomechanically, it kind of doesn't make sense anyway, but reducing momentum is the boogeyman of hypertrophy. And if you really reduce or take away momentum, you're going to get better hypertrophy. That doesn't play out in practice. And if anything, there does seem potentially to be a suboptimal effect. It seems to attenuate the hypertrophic response. So,
yeah, I would tell people, I think if you want to go a little bit slower on eccentrics, okay, but I think there is almost no upside to doing a slow concentric. I think for the most part, you should be trying to move a concentric as quickly as you can through the concentric portion of the lift. I don't see any, because you're basically, by reducing your rate of the concentric, you're reducing your force production. I don't see any reason to lower your force production because theoretically that would be less mechanical tension per rep as well.
I personally, and this has very limited evidence supporting it, but we actually had a study that somewhat supported it, somewhat did. But I'm a believer in the mind-muscle connection. That goes back to my bro days. And there's EMG evidence, by the way, that does support it, that you can focus on a muscle. To me, I'd never count. Do you count your reps, like the tempo of how fast? So I just try to focus on getting my muscle. We'll focus on the muscle I'm training, and I recommend that to people that are from a bodybuilder standpoint. Now, from a powerlifter, I'd go the opposite. If you're a powerlifter, you want to focus on the outcome, which is explosivity. So trying to get the weight up any way you can and focusing on an external cue. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, I'm a believer. Certainly, I don't think it hurts, and I think there may be some benefit to it.
Okay. Exercise choice. How much does exercise selection matter? And are there better exercises than other exercises? And I'll couch this when I'm thinking about a study looking at compound versus isolation and possibly showing differences in regional hypertrophy. So I would love to get your take on this topic.
Well, it definitely matters. So if you're, from a bodybuilding standpoint, if you're just doing, I've heard usually from powerlifters, just do the big three and you're going to, muscles have varied attachments. They actually, many muscles, some people don't realize, actually do not span from origin to insertion. They actually terminate within the fascicle intrafascicularly. And many are actually innervated by separate nerve branches. So basically, let's say in your quads, you can have fibers that are terminating well before they go from the hip joint to the knee joint. Let's say the rectus femoris or the upper femur to the knee joint. Anyway, it's theoretically a rationale for regional hypertrophy, as you mentioned, so site-specific hypertrophy. And thus having varied exercises, different exercises can more optimally stimulate various muscles. We actually carried out a study, really interesting. Ryan Burke was my student who carried this out. Shout out to him. But we looked at leg press versus leg extension. And the leg extension had greater effects on hypertrophy of the rectus femoris, whereas the leg extension had greater effects on the rec fem. The leg press had greater effects on the vastus lateralis. So combining them, conceivably, is going to optimize hypertrophy or help to of the quads. I could go on and on. I mean, just if you do a shoulder press, people think that's an overall shoulder exercise. Well, yeah, it does get to some extent all the heads of the deltoids are involved, but which muscle is directly opposing gravity in a shoulder press? It's the anterior delt. It's mostly an anterior delt exercise. So if you want to get the lateral delt, the mid delt, and the posterior delt, you need to have specific exercises focusing on that. The question of multi versus single, I mentioned the leg press versus leg extension. So depending on the movement, it can have regional effects. It may ultimately also have effects on where the hypertrophy is occurring. Let's say distal versus proximal. You don't have enough evidence on that. And I'd close by saying that I do think there is some benefit to having some rotation of exercises. The reason that muscles adapt is because of the novelty. It's a stimulus that it's not used to. So there's different ways of doing that. There's progressive overload, increasing the load. There can be increasing repetition rate. But having a novel stimulus of an exercise conceivably is another way to do that. And my general recommendation here, although we don't have, again, good research-based evidence, but I would say that having a rotation of if you want to do a squat. Now, I want to backtrack by saying there's no must-do exercise for hypertrophy. You don't need to do squats. You don't need to do leg extensions. But you need to do basic types of movements. I would say that a leg extension, again, has different differential effects than a leg press. You need to do some single joint movement. So you're not going to do a leg extension. Or you can do a reverse Nordic curl. You can do a sissy squat. Again, trying to do some single joint movement that's going to target your rec fem, assuming you want to develop that muscle. And if you're not going to do a squat, you want to do some compound movement variation. Could be a leg press, could be a hack squat, etc. But moving on to that, if you're doing a complex exercise like a squat, like a deadlift, certainly, like a bent row, a chest press, even anything that's with free weights, dumbbell presses, dumbbells, barbells, generally you want to keep them in a regular rotation, semi-regular rotation, because if I squatted today and didn't squat again for 3 months, I'm going to have a shitty squat. But if I did a leg extension today and didn't do it for 3 months, I'd do a perfect leg extension in 3 months. So you can rotate in your single joint, your machine-based movements, which lock you into a given degrees of freedom or limit your degrees of freedom and locks you into a given line of movement. So I think that having some variety in your routines can be a net benefit, provided it's done selectively. And you certainly don't, I want to emphasize, it's not like you need to have muscle confusion and do different things each day, but a recession. But you do, I think you potentially can benefit by having rotation of movements. And that involves differences between cables and machines and free weights. The disadvantages of machines are the advantages of free weights and vice versa. So I think by having some rotation in those types of movements, potentially can have some benefits on hypertrophy.
Yeah, my take home for people with this research data is do a variety of exercises and do them frequently enough that you are skilled at them and you get some adaptation, but do enough variety that there is some novelty that gets introduced over time. And that doesn't have to be, I think it's a really bad idea to change up exercises every single workout. I think that's really dumb. I also think it's really dumb to do the same exact program and exercises for months and months at a time. I think there's a middle ground of kind of targeted adjustments to your exercise selection. But if you are doing a variety of exercises, both compound and isolation, you are going to be getting the benefits of all of those. And so I think especially for hypertrophy, we know that variety is the spice of life. And there's a lot of different ways to grow muscle, and you should take advantage of as many of them as you can.
Agreed.
Okay, Brad, final question, and I ask this of all my guests. What is a belief that you once held strongly that you changed your mind on based on evidence?
Yeah, so certainly there's been quite a number to certain extents, but I'd say the biggest change is in the effect of loading on hypertrophy. And I'll give you a quick story. I think we have some time. So my colleague Stu Phillips, which I know you recently interviewed him, I believe, or will he? And terrific researcher out of Canada. He carried out a study circa 2012, and he looked at a group of untrained individuals, gave them leg extensions within subject design, by the way. And he had one group do 30% 1RM, which was like 30 reps, 35 reps plus. And the other group did 80% 1RM. And both were taken to failure, both for conditions. And 80% is like 8 reps of 1RM. And he came on Facebook and he said, new study just came out, proof of principle, loading does not have effects on hypertrophy. And I was brought up to believe on the hypertrophy continuum where that 6 to 12 reps, and basically anything over 15 reps was glorified cardio. And that you weren't going to, the idea was, and this was shown by some studies that I've come to realize were not properly designed to show the effect. But anyway, it was based on the theory that when you're doing leg load training, you are not engaging the highest threshold motor units, which are attached, basically which innervate the type 2 muscle fibers, which have the greatest potential for growth. So you're basically doing your endurance-based training. And I said in my infinite wisdom at that time, which fortunately I'm a wiser person now and never do, but I said, come on, Stu. So these are untrained subjects doing leg extensions. I said, I'm going to do an ecologically valid training program and well-trained. I said, and actually I think exact quote was, they would get jacked from doing cardio over spin cycling. And I said, I'm going to give well-trained subjects an ecologically valid training protocol, multiple exercises. You're going to see it's not going to be enough of a stimulus for more hypertrophy in well-trained subjects. Long story short, a year later, I carried out that study and no difference. Ate my words. And since then, we have had a plethora of studies showing the same thing. So I would say then, I mentioned earlier how the majority of studies, you're going to see equivocal evidence, some showing one thing. I would say with very high confidence, this is one thing I just can't see my opinion changing at this point because there's been so many studies and all of them show a null of that. There's really none show a superior, virtually none, on dozens and dozens of studies show a benefit to heavier load training or lighter. That there is no difference. When I say no difference, you can achieve similar hypertrophy with repetitions anywhere from 6 reps all the way up to 30 to 40 reps. Probably beyond that, I collaborated on a study that showed that very light loads, this was 70 plus repetitions, started to attenuate the response. You had a suboptimal response. My guess is they just got too bored to carry it out with a high level of effort. Now, this is predicated on taking the set very close to failure. So it's a training with a high level of effort. But I think that there's very little doubt at this point that you can gain similar amounts of muscle. Now, I will say this, certainly much less confidence in this, but I think there is the potential for a perhaps fiber type specific effect that light loads, and there's some logical basis to it. There's some evidence in blood flow restriction training that lighter loads may be preferential to type 1 hypertrophy. You still get very good type 2 hypertrophy, and there may be some benefit to heavier loads with maximizing type 2 hypertrophy. Equivocal, I would not be surprised if that did not ultimately pan out, and I would not be surprised if there was. But there is some evidence overall that combining rep ranges may be additive, and it could be for other reasons too. It could be that The heavier loads increase strength, which may have a transfer effect in mechanical tension during moderate load training, and that there's greater buffering capacity with lighter loads, that you build up greater affinity to buffer hydrogen ions, which can allow you to get more reps. Again, increase volume load with moderate load. So my general recommendation here would be that the majority of sets should be somewhere within your 6 to 15, 8 to 15 rep range. I think it's just efficient, but that having some 4 to 6 rep range can be beneficial maybe for strength and perhaps for optimizing type 2 development, although, again, equivocal. And then having some 15 to 25, 15 to 30 rep range training as well may, again, confer an additive effect. It's not, again, I don't think there's any downside to it. And if you're a bodybuilder, the potential upside would be potentially worthy.
Yeah, and again, this is practically what I recommend to people. Variety, right? Maybe there's unique benefits to low reps and high reps, and if that's the case, do both, right? And I do think that, one of the things I tell people is the limitation of these hypertrophy studies are the longest ones are 16 weeks. Maybe you get some that make it 24, very rare. And so, in the short term, we definitely know that load doesn't seem to matter for the most part within, 3 to 30 repetitions. It's about enough hard sets close enough to failure. But can I envision a scenario where over the long period of time, if you're doing a little bit of strength focused training where you get stronger in those, higher rep ranges compared to if you didn't do strength training, now you can use more load in those higher rep ranges, create more mechanical tension. Perhaps there is a long-term benefit to that. It's going to be hard to pick out in research data over time to be sure. This be a very difficult study to design and conduct. And so we're left with kind of, tenuous speculation. But again, as you mentioned, there's no downside to doing a variety. So do a variety because now you are hedging your bets that if there are unique benefits to certain rep ranges, you will get those unique benefits. And quite honestly, by doing a variety of rep ranges, it introduces novelty in terms of your own enjoyment of it. Because if you're always doing the same number of reps, it gets really boring. And so by having novelty improves adherence. And if I had to pick out the most important factor for muscle growth, other than intensity, it would be consistently putting in the work, right? And so if you enjoy your sessions, you're more likely to do them. So we land pretty much on the same page with these things from mechanistic speculation. It's funny, the mechanistic speculation ended up shaping a lot of my thoughts, but I haven't changed a ton of what I do in terms of resistance training and how I structure it over the years, but I landed on the things I do from a much more pragmatic perspective, that, okay, well, I just want to get people to do this consistently and work hard. I mean, that's by far the biggest thing. And when people say, Lane, what about these pro bodybuilders who look amazing, but look how they train? It's not science-based. I'm like, yeah, but they train really, really hard and they've been doing it for 20 years. So that's 99.9% of the battle right there.
Yeah, and of course they have people often defer to the bodybuilder. That's what I did when I was starting my bodybuilding career. The guy's got 22-inch arms and a 55-inch chest. You say, dude, how do you get to look like that? And of course, genetics are kind of important, like 50% important in terms of your overall results. And also they generally use these special supplements that the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And that was my downfall when I was starting out in my career, is that I figured that if I trained the way bodybuilders do, that I'd get their results, and without understanding that I didn't have the genetics or the special supplements. So.
Well, Brad, where can people find you? Are you taking graduate students for young students out there? Do you have any books or anything like that? Feel free to plug away.
Yeah, so I am definitely taking on master's students. You need to have some undergrad work in exercise, But yeah, definitely taking on masters, and I am taking on a select number of PhD students now as well to mentor. So you can email me or go to my see me on Instagram. But basically, I just say Google me, and you will find I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and Google me, and you'll find out all the info you need to find out.
Google him, bro. And if I had to put a Mount Rushmore of hypertrophy research, Brad Schoenfeld and Stuart Phillips, two people who got mentioned, Stu got mentioned frequently in this podcast. Those are the first two. That's George Washington and Abraham Lincoln that I'm putting on Mount Rushmore of hypertrophy training. So you guys make sure you follow Brad. Check out what he has to say. Not only does he publish very impactful research, but he comes from a very pragmatic place of having been a personal trainer, having been somebody who competed in bodybuilding. So he is looking for what are the practical takeaways in addition to trying to find out the mechanistic underpinning. So there's not a better follow out there for hypertrophy research. So we appreciate you coming on here, Brad. This was awesome. And thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, bud.